I'm going to begin. What I'll do is, if anyone does have a question, we'll keep those towards the end, and hopefully you'll have some time to answer some questions. But I wanted to just begin with, first of all, thank you to Karen Nagel, who again connected us and was not able to join today. But I did want to share a little bit about Aaron Lieberman before he shares a little bit about himself and any other points that I think are dear to him and to our city and community. So Aaron Lieberman is a member of the Arizona House of Representatives representing LD District 28. Again, that's right here in my neighborhood near Squaw Peak and Paestawa Peak area. Aaron grew up in this district while attending Yale. He founded a company called Jumpstart, a national not-for-profit whose vision is to ensure that every child in America enters kindergarten prepared to succeed. And then after graduation, while getting Jumpstart off the ground, he worked as a Head Start teacher in Boston. He then led Jumpstart for 7 years. To date, there are over 50,000 college students that have served as Jumpstart core members, earning over $200 million in college scholarships through the AmeriCorps, while working with over 100,000 young children. In 2002, Aaron founded Accelero Learning, and I'm hoping I pronounced that correctly, a company focused on closing the achievement gap for Head Start children and families. Children enrolled in Accelero's program make gains in nearly 3 times the national average. Today, Accelero employs over 1,800 staff and directly impacts more than 30,000 low-income young children every week. As a first-time political candidate, Aaron brought his dedication and work ethic with him to succeed. He knocked on over 5,000 doors and won by just 2%. And I was sharing with others on Friday and as well this morning that I know people in the neighborhood that Aaron knocked on their door that told me that not just was it that he knocked on the door, but took the time to answer questions that they had, even if they knew in the beginning of the conversation they weren't on the same sides of the political aisle. I know that firsthand from a number of friends in this neighborhood who really appreciated that. Aaron ran with the goal serving every person in this district since being elected. He has worked with Democrats and Republicans, tackling everything from doubling teacher funding for STEM certification to making sure our seniors can play bingo in their community rooms. He serves on the Education and Appropriations committees. So I'm going to spotlight your video. I'll let you share whatever you'd like to share, and then we have a couple of prepared questions and then some questions that people have been sharing with me as well. If anyone does have a question that they wanted to ask Aaron directly, we'll have an opportunity to either unmute your mic or through the chat. Thank you, Aaron.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me, Rabbi Levertov, and for Karen for setting this up. And it's just great to be with everybody and to kind of get a chance to have lunch together to a certain extent. I'll just kind of echo some of the points of my bio that Rabbi Levertov hit, which is, I was born and raised, I really grew up on 22nd Street, right around the corner from the Chabad house there. And for many of the folks on this call, I'm guessing you were in Arizona in the 80s. That's not always the case with so many people that have moved here, but it was just a different political time. And I kind of have come to appreciate this. Nostalgia is a powerful thing. When you look back at things, everything seems better, but I've really kind of gone and looked at it. And it was really a golden era for kind of political change in Arizona in that period of time. And I think because at its core, our Democrats and our Republicans were actually working together. For most of the 80s, we had a Democratic governor, Bruce Babbitt. One of my predecessors in the state house, who would have been from LD 28 today, Burton Barr, was the majority leader for the Republicans for that whole time period. That's probably a familiar name. He was a neighbor to most of the folks in Central Phoenix. But Burton Barr and Bruce Babbitt, the governor would actually go to Burton Barr's house every Sunday when the legislature was in session and pick up the newspaper at the curb, walk it in, and they'd sit down and have a cup of coffee and talk about how they were going to move the state forward together, not as Democrats or Republicans, but as Arizonans. And I just think we need a lot more of that spirit. But by the way, they were really successful in doing things that hadn't happened before. From that period of time, Arizona, in 1982, we passed the Groundwater Management Act that said if you are building a new housing development, you have to have a certificate to show you have a water supply that will provide enough water for that home for 100 years. I mean, that's how forward-thinking they were. The state joined Medicaid. We were actually the last state in the country to join Medicaid. But we did it in a totally different way. We did it in a public-private partnership. For those of you who are familiar, we call it Access Today, our Arizona Health Cost Containment System. It's a mouthful, but it's been an absolute national model that has gone around the nation as a way to have high-quality healthcare and control costs. this happened because both parties were really willing to work together. Nobody got all that they wanted, but everybody got something, and they really moved the state forward. And as a kid growing up here, I thought this was the best place in the world to be a kid, and I completely loved it. And I think a lot, I always say, 300 days of sunshine doesn't hurt, but a lot of that was kind of the optimism and the thing that I still love about Arizona. So many of us, so many people came here from somewhere else. My family moved here about 55 years ago, and everyone was from somewhere else. It didn't matter who you knew or, you know, who your dad was. We all kind of got along and worked together. And I think that's what made the state, and in many respects continues to make the state so special. After graduating high school, I went to Yale for college. I started Jumpstart, as Rabbi Levertov mentioned, out of my college dorm room. And I ended up working between Boston and New York City for many years, building and growing two organizations, Jumpstart and Oscillera Learning, to help, you know, eventually connect with hundreds of thousands of kids and families all across the country. And now, a little over 5 years ago now, I moved back home. I've got, then there were little boys. Now one's starting his freshman year in high school, one's a 7th grader. And I always joke, there's only so many times you can say, don't bounce the ball in the apartment before you're like, we got to do something else here as parents. And with two rambunctious boys and most of my family back here, we moved back here. And I just could not believe the sorry state of our politics, quite honestly. So much divisiveness, so much fighting. This reputation that Arizona had when I grew up of kind of being a place where people got along was replaced by lots of divisive and extreme ideas. And what was really difficult for me to see was just a real disinvestment, particularly in public education and public schools. And to see when I was a kid, we were about 24th or 25th in funding our public schools. Now, even with the recent attempts to put some of the cuts back, we're at about 48th or 49th, depending on what you look at. And it's not just K-12, you know, the legislature, it was before I got there, but they slashed funding for higher education in 2009, gutting it by more than half. During that same period of time, the last 10, 12 years, they've doubled funding for our jails and our Department of Corrections. So we now spend twice what we spend on helping kids get to college or do something after high school. We spend $2 locking people up. Many of our prisoners are there because they had substance abuse issues, never hurt anyone but themselves. And by the way, aren't getting the help that they need in prison, even though we're all collectively paying, you know, tens and thousands and collectively hundreds of millions of dollars, keep them locked up. So I just think there's a different path here where people work more in the middle and more collaboratively to actually do what we know. And it's pretty clear in polling, there's huge majorities. I mean, we're talking like 80+% for common sense criminal justice reform, for fully funding our schools, for doing some of these really basic things that unfortunately the legislature has been ignoring and not doing. And that's what I think we need to get back to. That's why I ran, and that's what I continue to do every day when I go down to the Capitol. And so, you know, I just really look forward to the conversation. And I think, Rabbi Levertov, you have a few questions to get started, and then we'll open it up. I'm eager to hear from folks.
Thank you. And I know that, so you actually answered some of them, but I think we can touch on them, and then you can, you know, either elaborate or we'll move on. So the first thing was, why did you want to become a state legislator? And I know you mentioned, you know, education was key. Was that the decision? Was that the real decision process that pushed you in that direction for office?
Yeah, we had a lot of it was, you know, the person. It's a very confusing system that we have for state legislative races here in Arizona. The entire state's divided into 30 legislative districts. When they were created, they each had about 225,000 people in them at the time. They're drawn every 10 years. And each legislative district then has 2 state representatives and 1 state senator. And we had 1 Democratic state representative, Kelly Butler, who I work alongside. She leads a lot of the healthcare stuff. And we had a state rep who was a Republican, who, you know, my dad is a Republican, my brother's a Republican. There's plenty of nice Republicans in the state. But she was pretty extreme on a whole set of social issues. And she called the Red for Ed teacher leaders socialists in the height of the Red for Ed movement. She, you know, voted for a set of things that would have been very, very challenging in terms of continuing to fund our public schools. And I just didn't feel like she represented me, or honestly, this district that you know, where I grew up and that I love so much, very well. And it was almost as much as her kind of extreme positioning as anything else that got me into the race. You know, A lot of life is timing, and I've always enjoyed service in one side or another. It's been baked into me from a very, very young age. And a lot of that, I mean, I think we'll talk about this, but a lot of that goes back to this idea of repair of the world, tikkun olam, and what are we all doing to try to make the world as we want it to be instead of as it is. And so those two things kind of came together at a personal moment with good timing and an opportunity. I don't think many people thought I was going to win. It was against long odds, but I'm really happy that I did it, and I've been really honored to be able to serve ever since.
Yeah, thank you. And I know that for those of us who did check out your website before, you have a beautiful picture of your family on there. Did you want to share a little bit about your family, or?
Yeah, I have. I actually feel bad because she's not pictured because she's never been able to be here when we were taking those pictures. But I have a daughter from a previous marriage who's in college. She would be going into her senior year at Yale, but she's taking the semester off because of all the Corona stuff while they're down there. And then I have two wonderful boys who are now in 7th grade and 9th grade. We adopted both of them when they were infants, in a couple years apart, but they were both born in Ethiopia and raised between, New York and now, although now they feel both very much like Arizona kids. And that's kind of been a part of our own journey as well, is just trying to make sure that we're doing everything we can to contribute to a life. I think, like so many parents, you want your kids to have a world that's a little bit better than the one that you had. And I think that's a part of this journey for my family as well.
And Aaron, just a quick interjection. Are you using the gallery view, or did you keep it on the spotlight? Because you can change that to see everyone, so you could gauge reactions.
Oh, okay.
Top right, you should be able to do a gallery view.
Perfect. I got it.
Okay, awesome. All right. Has Judaism played a role in your value and priority of education, and then, of course, in general in your service?
Yeah. I mean, I did touch on this, but I think the short answer is very, very much so. My mom, when I was very little, I don't even remember, we actually lived in Tempe, and my mom was the founding first president of Temple Emmanuel, which grew into the largest congregation in Tempe. By the time we were in kindergarten, we had moved up to 22nd Street, and my mom had taught at Phoenix Hebrew Academy at one point. We kind of moved between Solel, Phoenix Hebrew Academy, and Bethel, all kind of in the neighborhood at different points. But it was very much, to me, the central call of Judaism, and the animating idea is this idea of tikkun olam, that we are literally here to make the world a better place. And it's funny. I mean, my mom got a PhD in early childhood and always worked in preschool for low-income kids. My dad was a lawyer, but my family's been actively involved with foster kids, a whole set of different ways to try to help make the world better. But when I look back at it, nobody ever explicitly was teaching these lessons on a whiteboard. It was more lessons in how they acted and what they did and how they treated everybody in the world. And I think a lot of my professional life actually stemmed from getting out in the world and seeing things being so different than how I was taught that they should be, in terms of equal opportunity for all and all of those things, and being confronted with that. One of the things that had the biggest impact on my life was actually working at a summer camp run by the Jewish Federation in Dutchess County, New York, just about an hour and a half outside of New York City. My parents had worked there, at the time it was probably 30 years prior, right before and after they were married. And it was a camp for kids who were really struggling, and they used to call them troubled kids. And for a while, there was a long tradition of Jewish kids who were really struggling. Over time, it kind of started being increasingly kids coming out of New York City, but the Jewish Federation continued to fund it. And it was just an amazing place where I literally would have parents come at the end and pick up their kids, many of whom are really struggling in life, and say, wow, this looks like a different little boy. This is a different kid than we put on the bus. And that kind of seeing firsthand how you can help all kids be successful if there's enough resources in the environment, and how you can at least start to work with parents, was the real inspiration for Jumpstart a lot of my life. And that was all at a Federation sponsored camp.
That's pretty cool. So I know I'm jumping back on, you mentioned about the Jumpstart. What was your, I guess, inspiration in college that inspired you to do that?
It really was that camp. It's called Ramapo. Now it's called Ramapo for Children. Then it was called Ramapo Anchorage Camp, where we had this. There was a 3-week program for preschoolers, if you could believe it. Now, as a parent, I look back and I'm like, their kids would go away for 3 weeks, and they were 4 years old. But most of the homes, there had been the social service agencies intervening in the homes. In many cases, it was like a respite. foster parents or others. But we had one adult for every kid there in the overall ratio. And my mom would come and help provide some of the kind of counselor training. And I saw in that learning center time that she kind of designed the incredible power of one adult working with one child. But the limitations were also obvious. It was the parents weren't involved in a day-to-day basis. It was in almost like Disneyland, this beautiful 200-acre camp on a lake in Dutchess County. So I went into my senior year at Yale with the idea of, can we take that kind of learning part of that and that connection that happens between an adult and a child and make it happen right in the communities where the kids live and really involve the parents as partners. And that's what we set out to do with Jumpstart with nothing in my career has had a big plan. It was just what's in front of you. How can we try to make something happen here, and then seeing where it goes. And a lot of life is timing, and that whole idea really took off. And I ended up over 8 years really learning a lot how to build and grow an organization. And it was an incredible education, but the thing that always motivated me so much was the actual difference made in classrooms when college students were directly volunteering with kids. And just so glad that happened, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of times.
That's pretty amazing. So just to jump a little bit onto the legislative side, what are or is one of the goals that you accomplished as a state legislator or as a state representative that highlights really your values?
Yeah, well, let me just say, unfortunately, the legislature has really been run as a winner-take-all operation. That's one of the great challenges down there. And I say that because, with me winning my year, there were 4 Democrats that beat Republicans. And so the legislature is 31 Republicans to 29 Democrats. And in fact, the closest race that a Republican won was won by like 600 votes up in Flagstaff. So, it's basically really divided, evenly split. If there were, 300 more people voted differently, we would literally be tied 30-30. And at the end of my first legislative session, every year, this last year was different because of COVID, but normally the legislature passes somewhere between 300 and 400 bills. I think it was about 330 bills and that the governor signed, and 7 of those 330, or I think that was about the number, were actually prime sponsored by a Democrat. So even in the state Senate, it's 17 Republicans to 13 Democrats, and in the state House, it's basically tied. 98% of all of the bills that were signed were Republican bills. The committee chairs, all of whom are Republicans, have absolute discretion on deciding whether to hear a bill or not. And then the budget negotiation happens almost pretty much exclusively just with Republicans hashing out what they're going to do. So that was one of my biggest disappointments, is that there hasn't been that opportunity to really work across the aisle. That said, the first bill I introduced was a bill that would provide matching scholarship funds for someone. If you do a year of service in the state of Arizona in AmeriCorps, you get a $5,600 federal scholarship. This bill would match that with state funds. I actually named it after John McCain, who was a huge defender and champion for citizen service. And the Speaker of the House and the Chair of Appropriations and Ed, all of whom are Republicans, co-sponsored it with me. It actually got voted out of the House, 48 votes to just 12 against. But it didn't get in the budget because there was no input for Democrats in that budget process. So I was very proud. I've had several other bills on childcare for low-income working moms and things like that. And the bingo bill for, I don't know if any of you are involved with bingo, but up north in the northern part of the district, there's a real issue with hitting the limit on these social bingo games. And we actually had that all fixed and got that through a Republican committee through the House. I think it was 60-0 or 58-2 or something like that. And that one would have eventually gotten to the governor's desk before COVID shut things down. Some of the things you mentioned in my bio, I was able to get an amendment to double funding for our science teachers who want to go back and get a STEM certificate. We were able to double funding on that by working with one of my Republican colleagues. Because I serve on education and appropriations, often you see the education bills on Monday and then they're in appropriations on Wednesday. So in those 2 days, we're able to kind of negotiate and work something out there. But I've also learned that a lot of what you can do at the legislature doesn't have anything to do with passing a bill. And I think there have been a couple of things in that spirit. One is actually right that you guys are dealing with right now in terms of anybody living in that 22nd Street area. They were going to put that pipeline, the water pipeline, right through Madison Heights and then turn it over and send it right through 22nd Street and right through the mountain preserves. and it would have chewed up 14 acres of preserves and then tunneled through the back of the mountains to get over to Dreamy Draw. And having grown up riding, my dirt bike all through those mountains for many, many years, I was like, this just doesn't make any sense. If the pipe is over at Madison Heights behind you all, just take a left and run it along the freeway. For whatever reason, they hadn't done that. I got with the mayor and the Department of Transportation, and they actually worked out a compromise to do exactly that. So the pipeline was able to completely stay out of the preserve. It's still going to be unfortunate for some of the neighbors, and you see that right now where they're putting it underneath Glendale there. But it's a lot better solution than it would have been. And that just came from getting people in the room and saying, hey, can we work something out? I think somewhat similarly, over the last couple of months, my own kid goes to Cocopar, our neighborhood SUS, the Scottsdale Unified School. And I just saw what happened when this pandemic shut all the schools down and everyone pivoted to distance learning. And the teachers did all that they could, but none of those teachers were trained as teachers for distance learning environments. They never wanted to do that. They wanted to teach in a school. But over the summer, I was able to work with the governor's office and the Arizona Department of Education. They each contributed $2.5 million. The Helios Foundation contributed $2.5 million. And that $7.5 million is being used to help any teacher in the state get professional development from ASU on how to be excellent digital and distance learners, which is such an important issue because still, at least for a little while longer, all of our schools are set up in that remote fashion. And I think that's been another opportunity if I was just able to kind of unstick things and stay on it and kind of work to shape things without ever having to cast a vote on the floor of the House, but that's going to end up impacting, hundreds of thousands of kids. And honestly, that's one of the things that I feel most proud about as it's rolling out right now.
And I think those are truly impactful. So I have I guess a question that maybe others have as well. Being a state legislative representative, and talking about the water, talking about a water pipeline, which is sort of a municipal thing, I'm assuming.
Yeah.
So are people sort of coming to the wrong address when they're asking you that, and they should be talking to their council member, or is there an overlap?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and there's a lot of confusion for just the general public around like, what does the legislature do? What is, we'll get emails all the time like about the Federal CARES Act and other things like that. It's like, what is it that the legislature does? And it really boils down to education and healthcare as well as incarceration. I mean, those are the biggest chunks of how we spend the state budget, are the things that are mostly impacted at the state level. But again, there is that ability to kind of convene and get people together. In the case of the pipeline, I went to the meeting, some neighbors called me and said, this is crazy. I went to the first meeting at Madison Heights and saw what they were trying to do. And I just stood up and said, this doesn't make any sense. Let's work on it. And that issue, part of the issue was getting the Arizona Department of Transportation. They owned the right of way along the 51, since the 51 is a state route. So that was one of these things that kind of blended it. But my first call was to the mayor, and Mayor Geiger was great. She's like, all right, this doesn't make any sense to me either. Let's, so sometimes it's just getting attention of the right municipal person. But you're definitely right. The potholes and the street lamps and, all of those things tend to fall on city council, but there are sometimes these state, overlays on things that are important. It's also important, like what we don't do. We don't deal with federal immigration policy. We're not able to run up a huge deficit like they do at the federal level. We have to balance the state budget every single year. So there are a whole set of things that really are federal issues that we don't directly, impact, but it's a little bit of the same thing where we can often make a call and talk to Congressman Stantz or senators and whoever needs to, we can get attention on it. I think the nice thing, and this has happened a lot over the last couple of months, unemployment, even though a lot of it has in the recent history been funded federally, is administered by the state. And we've had hundreds of constituents reach out saying, I can't get through to the unemployment agency. We've had 600,000 Arizonans at one point or another be on unemployment. If you think about the fact we have 8 million people and a couple million of them are kids, basically 1 in 10 Arizonans have been on unemployment at one point through this pandemic. Our system was just totally overwhelmed, and we helped a lot of them make sure that the Department of Economic Security was getting back to them, straightening out, figuring out what their problem was, and eventually getting them the check that was owed. And that was really gratifying too, when we can help in that constituent services perspective.
That's actually informative. So I guess really on that same question, and I guess Medicare, Medicaid, does that come through you as well?
Yeah, so that functions as a block grant to the state, and then the state is deciding what the guidelines are and how it's going to be run. So that's really our influence on healthcare. We set up and set up the state law that guides both, particularly Medicaid, and even to a lesser extent Medicare. But on the health stuff, I tend to focus on education and appropriations, and Kelly Butler, who is our ranking member on health, tends to go deeper on the health stuff. But we end up being able to influence and impact how a lot of those dollars are spent, although we don't fund them. It's money coming from the feds.
Right. So I guess on that same question, in the sense of what other items or things do you, as a legislative body, do that impact seniors? And what about continuing education with seniors? I know that some of the universities provide courses that seniors can sit in. Is that something that you're involved with?
Yeah. So anything higher education related, again, we kind of authorize, historically the state funded. Our state constitution actually says higher education is supposed to be as nearly free as possible. We have not delivered on that, certainly over the last 10 years, in terms of cutting state funding for that. But we certainly support the higher ed institutions in that world, and we kind of oversee and can guide their work. The State Board of Education, similarly. And I think for seniors, there's just a whole set of quality of life, issues that often end up getting, if it's bigger than any one city, they end up getting to the legislature. One of those big issues that I've also been very involved with is Airbnbs. That I'm actually curious if anyone on this phone call has had an issue, if you would just nod your head or wave with Airbnbs in your neighborhood. It's the number one thing that I've heard about from constituents of short-term rentals basically being used as party houses. And some of these stories are heartbreaking of parents. One mom said she won't let her kid walk around her neighborhood on the weekend anymore because there's strangers in front of a couple of these houses, sitting out, drinking, doing all sorts of things that they shouldn't be doing. Well, you'd say, well, why does it have to do with the state legislature? Well, in 2015, the legislature, in all their wisdom, banned the ability for cities and towns to regulate short-term rentals. Basically said you can literally advertise as many beds as you want. It essentially destroyed residential zoning because now you can have, and we see this in Paradise Valley, but in Central Phoenix too, if you go on Airbnb, you could be living right next door to not even a place where an owner is renting out a room. Most people are okay with that. I certainly am. But it's investor-owned properties that are being run as hotels throughout our neighborhoods without the actual owner even there. And to me, that doesn't make any sense. And one of the things I really fight for is how do you get local control back to our cities and towns so that city council person or that local mayor can have a bigger influence. And I learned a long time ago, the best answers are usually in the heads of those closest to the problem. And that's what I try to do in terms of making sure from a solutions perspective that we defer to our cities and towns whenever we can. That's
actually interesting how that plays out. So here's something you mentioned. I think I'm actually curious about this, prison reform. So how is Arizona doing, I guess, on that? I know that I remember reading about this. I was invited to join this. I wasn't able to, but the governor's office has some sort of, they're working on something. I don't know if it's prison reform, but more about, reducing recidivism.
Yeah.
How are we as a state on that?
Yeah. Terrible is the short answer. We have a disastrous law from the 1990s called Truth in Sentencing that requires that you do 85% of any sentence that you're sentenced to, that you serve all of that time out. And essentially what it took me a long time to realize, because I wasn't familiar with this area, but I've come to appreciate it. Someone said it to me and it made sense. What this basically does is take the sentencing function out of the hands of the judges, who are actually, by and large, do a pretty good job. They're thoughtful, they can look at this. Instead, it really hands it over to the prosecutors because they can stack up charges against somebody, all of whom then have a mandatory 85% sentence. They do that a lot as a negotiating ploy, but in the end, how long people spend in jail is out of judges' hands. And alongside that, what we've ended up with is a lot of drug offenses, and it does have to be second or third time offenses, but that were possession. I mean, these are people who need treatment. I think many of us have had people in our lives who have dealt with this. They need treatment, and they often get better with treatment. They don't get it in jail, and it's very expensive, and we're locking them up for, in many instances, decades at a time. And just to give you a sense, this is one of the things that's so frustrating to me. Texas, dominated by Republicans in the State House, State Senate, and the governor for the last 2 decades. In 2009, they passed criminal justice reform. They've saved $4 billion by not locking up people who have drug offenses and instead giving them treatment. We estimate in our annual budget in Arizona, the overall state budget is $12 billion. We could save $400 million annually by getting out of the business of locking up drug offenders for every last thing and instead giving them treatment and diversion programs. And again, from my perspective, these are not violent people. If you're violent, I understand violent criminals need to be in jail and we need to make sure that they get treated. We have our jails full of nonviolent criminals who never hurt anyone but themselves. And there's a much better way to deal with that. Rabbi Levertov, the governor has made some progress in they call them reentry centers and better training people after they've done these really long jail sentences. And the thing to just remember about these jail sentences, it's all of us paying for it. Those are our tax dollars that are paying for it. And, there's lots of evidence. There's still tons of drugs in the jails, unfortunately, and in our prisons. And people, like 2% of people get substance abuse counseling in prison, when we know many more of them need it. So that is one of the areas. There are actually some Republican supporters for that now. There's the Koch brothers in particular. There's an interesting potential alliance of some right-leaning groups and some left-leaning groups on criminal justice reform, but we haven't even been able to get a bill heard in the Judiciary Committee for the last 2 years because the chair of that committee just didn't want to hear any of it, even though the bills was sponsored by a Republican. So it's one of the areas where the legislature, unfortunately, has been gummed up, and 80% of Arizonans support some of these common sense measures, and we just haven't had a legislature that will have listened up to this point.
That's actually so. Let's say I'm very into prison reform. Who is the right, correct address for people to, let's say they wanted to mention something?
Yeah. Look, you can go to your state rep and your state senator. I mean, when I get emails from individual constituents, if they put their address in there, identify as a constituent, I respond to every single one. Often we call it AstroTurf. They're kind of organizations that have auto-generate things. But even then, if I know you're a constituent, and if someone really sits down and types and says, hey, this is a big issue for me, I'd like to know where it is, the reality is it is, of our 30 legislative districts across the state, 25 are either dominated by Republicans or dominated by Democrats. And whoever wins those primaries with a very small number of votes, sometimes 5,000, 6,000 votes, will be the nominee from that district. Our district is one of the ones it's almost evenly now, a third Republican, a third Democrat, and a third independent. When I got elected, there were 10,000 more Republicans than Democrats. Just a couple years later now, that's down to 5,000 more Republicans than Democrats. But this is an area where I think people can really articulate, hey, what are you doing and what's happening? Because we want something done differently. And if enough people hear from that, hopefully it'll make a difference, particularly if anyone's here living in Scottsdale. You know what I mean? You have there's a potential close race in Scottsdale this time for the first time in a long time. But there's also representatives who should hear from you saying, hey, we're regular voters and this isn't right. We want something different and some attention paid.
So can I sort of follow up my question on that? Because you had mentioned that the chairman of whatever that group or board isn't even listening to it. That's what I'm saying. Yeah. So in other words, you can take as many emails as you want. Do you have to bring him a stack of paper to show that people care about it? Or is it really they have to direct it to him directly?
It's a good point. It really depends on the chairperson and their willingness to listen. I think in a lot of the stuff, there's coalitions that have formed around these that are good to add your voice to. But that chairman was John Allen, who represented District 15, and probably some people's on this call. 15 is now it's going to be Nancy Barto, or was Nancy Barto and Heather Carter and John Allen. This is a guy who's, it's the east side of Phoenix, north of Shea, call it. Being able to talk to him directly about that and just getting more representatives down there who understand that that's a big issue where they're going to the chairman and they're hearing it from them, I think makes a big deal. We really won't know who the chair people are of these committees until after the election. The speaker's determined, and then he or she will say who the chairwomen are, or chairman, and then that's the time to kind of try to get in there and influence it.
I got you. Okay, thank you. So I'm going to go to some of the questions in the chat, and then I have some questions someone emailed, and you can take as much as you want on each one. So first question was, and I am not as educated about this, so you might want to also educate us what the bill is. Do you support 208, the education bill, and then why or why not?
Yeah, that's the Invest in Education bill that's going to be on the ballot. And essentially what it says is if you're making over $500,000 a year as a couple or $250,000 as an individual, this is a very important point. Your income above that amount, not your income up to that amount, but your income above 500,000 as a couple will be taxed with an additional, I think it's 2 percentage points. I'm not exactly sure. I think the rate's around 4.5%, and it takes it up to like 6.5% just on that additional income. This is not how I would have designed it. I mean, we need to figure out more funding for our schools. We've been in an incredible jam on this for a long time. The legislature basically can't raise taxes because of a previous citizens initiative says you need a 2/3 vote of the legislature to raise taxes. So these things have to go to the ballot, and I think that's good for something like this. It's a big decision. I definitely support letting the voters of Arizona decide on these issues themselves. And it's because the legislature hasn't been able to do anything for so long that I think these types of end arounds going directly to the voters is needed. I would have designed it a little bit differently. I'm sensitive to the folks who say, look, why am I the only one being asked to do my share if I'm in this very high tax bracket? Why isn't it a little broader based? But we've got to do something, and we really need additional support for our schools. And I think that the fact that this is so targeted, and again, it's really important. It's only on that income above that amount. And I think that that's the opportunity is to ask those who are doing very, very, very well to pay a little bit more. But by the way, everyone has had their Arizona income taxes cut. The rate used to be about 7.5% for everybody. And over 20 years, there's been cuts almost every single year. One of the most heartbreaking things for me was my first legislative session. We as part of an agreement to tax out-of-state internet retailers, the Republican majority straight party line vote cut $400 million in taxes. That's half of what this Invest in Ed thing will raise. If we just didn't do that, we would have had, $2 billion more for our schools over 5 years. And, I represent the highest income zip code in the state, 85253. This was passed after our state taxes were already due on April 15th. Not one person, and I get emails every day, not one person emailed me complaining about how high their state tax rate is. And we went and did this across the board cut for $400 million. Again, it's just not the priorities of where the rest of the state is. So we got to do something on education funding. I'm very glad to have the voters have their decision on this. And I think it's important that we really look at what are the options to get more money to our schools.
That's interesting take on that one. So I'm saying it's interesting that you have the highest earners and not really getting the feedback, or I should say the negative feedback. So here's another question that somebody asked. In the sense of your being Jewish, have you experienced any negativism in the political arena?
That's really interesting. I think, in some instances, I would say probably not very much. I haven't really felt it as like any anti-Semitism or something like that. And I think that speaks a lot to Arizona. I did have a funny thing, which is there was a bill that I co-sponsored. I went on a whole delegation on a trip to Israel last year, which was awesome. It was really great. We actually opened up an Arizona-Israeli trade office. And, there's the goal of every Israeli entrepreneur is to get their company to the U.S. where they can really take off, and many of them have. And the more that we can see people as, Arizona is a great choice to do that. You don't have to go to New York or California. There's a lot of positives. Plus, when they get off the plane, they can look around and still feel like they're in Israel from many, weather and locale perspectives. So there's like a lot of things that work on this. But we sponsored a bill that would have made it mandatory to teach about the Holocaust and other genocides in K-12 school, which I think is a terrific idea. I don't know if this is in the news a little bit. Dennis Welch, one of the channels, interviewed me. We had a Republican member of the House say a week ago that wearing a mask is like the Nazis tattooing Jews during the Holocaust, if you can believe that. And, I just said, this is ridiculous. You can have political disputes on those things, but leave the Holocaust out of this. It's such a unique stain on human history, and to liken that to literally public health efforts designed to save lives is beyond the pale. But when we were working on this bill to teach the Holocaust, it's so important. If you look at the numbers, the number of people who don't believe it or don't understand what it is, just to make sure that it's consistently taught, I thought was really important. And we have, the same year I got elected, Alma Hernandez got elected. Alma is the first Jewish Latina elected in the United States. She's 26 years old, and she's very passionate Jewish woman. And she sponsored the bill. I co-sponsored it. And we were having a meeting with the leadership in the House, and they said they wanted Michelle Udall, who is the head of our education committee, to be the prime sponsor on the bill. And Miss Udall is very nice. She's a Mormon educator, public school teacher. And I just said, you know, we were in this meeting, and I said, well, if Hitler had been successful in eradicating all of the Jews, we need Ms. Udall or someone else to run a bill like this on our behalf. But since he wasn't, and we're here and still alive, I think a Jew can be the prime sponsor of a bill like this. And you could have heard a pin drop in that room when after I had said that, and the chief of staff just was like, okay. And Alma sponsored the bill. It was literally 60-0 out of the House without a single, almost everybody co-sponsored it. I mean, it's just one of the most powerful things that we've had. And that's one of those times when I don't believe there have been, we also had another member, actually, he just finally converted a few weeks ago. So we now have 3 Jews in the House. And I think previous to this, it's not clear to me that there were any. I don't know how long that's been the case. But part of this has been a process of just recognizing, look, we can speak in our own voice, loud and proud. And there's an opportunity to do that in the Capitol right now.
Thank you. Was David Shapira also a state legislator, or he was?
David Shapiro was, I think, in the state house. I know he was in the state Senate for a while too, and I think maybe in the House before that. And we've had lots of Jewish legislators over the years. I just mean like right now.
Yeah, no, I understood that. So do you mind if I go to, I guess, a more current event topic that this person had emailed me about?
Sure.
It's about police funding. So I know that I'm assuming your body of legislation sort of can affect state police like DPS more than the local city municipal departments. Yeah. But I guess this is his question. It's a 2-part question. What is your opinion regarding reducing police funding? And then again, what are your suggestions regarding additional police training?
Yeah, great question. First of all, the idea of, the name defund the police is a ridiculous name and a ridiculous idea. One of the dumb things about it is it doesn't actually even convey what the people who are sponsoring that want it to. They're basically saying, let's look at what the issues police get involved with versus others. But the idea that we're going to zero out funding for the police and have people feel safe, that makes absolutely zero sense. And I'm totally opposed to the notion that we should disband our police departments. That's craziness to me. I think what we've heard this from Chief Williams in Phoenix, do we need to send a policeman? She says this, do we need to send a policeman to pick up a homeless person at Circle K? This is someone who's trained in the police academy, who we have armed and all of this other stuff. I think the answer is probably not, if we can figure out another good way to incorporate mental health specialists and others. And a lot of our jurisdictions are working on this. They call it diversion programs. People who are trained essentially as social workers to help get involved in a lot of that frontline stuff. And if there's an opportunity to better invest our city dollars in that, everybody, including the police, I think would be supportive. But to the core issue, and this was such an opportunity, I hope still is, that we haven't missed it. There's a set of really common sense things we can do to help both the police and the people that they interact with and arrest feel safer every single day. Body cameras is a great example. We have body cameras in the city of Phoenix. We don't have them for our DPS officers in nearly the amounts that we need. This is a bipartisan supported. The governor proposed $5 million for body cameras in his budget. Our state representative, a Democrat from LD24, Dr. Amish Shah, had a bill that went 6-0 through the House. Like, we should just come into special session and say, let's do body cameras for DPS workers. And the same day that George Floyd was killed in Minnesota, we had a black man killed on the 101 north of Tatum here in Phoenix at 6 a.m. by a DPS officer. We really don't know what happened. It was just a DPS motorcycle officer and him. We know there was a gun in the car that the officer removed. The guy was sleeping in his car, and he ended up, the guy in the car, after the gun was removed, ended up shot and killed by the officer. We don't know what happened. because there wasn't a GPS body camera on. Our police unions, we have two big police unions in the state, they support body cameras. So, you know, and similarly, there's broad support for the ideas of a criminal justice database. If you have been disciplined for excessive use of force in one police department, that information would be available to other police departments as they go through the hiring process. That's a bill that Reginald Boulding, one of our Democratic members, he's been in the legislature for 6 years. He hasn't been able to get a hearing for that. Again, even our police unions support that. There's common sense stuff we could do that help the police and the people they interact with, and even the people they arrest, have everybody feel safer. Because good cops don't like bad cops either. Everyone wants to have a system in which it's very clear if people are crossing the line that they're held accountable for it. We need to put some more basic things in place to help make that happen, and there should be widespread agreement on this.
Thank you. And then I guess the same person, have you heard of the What You Do Matters program? It's based out of Yavapai County, I think, from Sheila Polk.
Yeah, I believe. Yeah. I think that's the diversion, one of the diversion programs that they were talking about. I haven't heard it under that name, but I know Sheila Polk has done this big diversion program that has really helped reduce the folks coming into those county jails, because it's exactly what I'm talking about. At the point of first interaction, they're getting social workers and others out there who are diverting those folks from ever entering the criminal justice system.
No, so it's a different program, but I'll share. It's basically teaching lessons from the Holocaust to police officers.
Oh, I had not heard of that.
Okay, so that was what he wanted. He was just curious if you knew that. And I guess on that same question, was the Holocaust bill passed all the way through the Senate?
So unfortunately, it was because of COVID, it was up to it needed one more action on the final Senate floor, and all of the bills stopped and were died. And that was one of the ones that would have gone in my bingo bill. Literally, if there was one more day of session, it probably would have happened. So it'll take us till next legislative session to do it, but that will definitely happen.
When does next session begin?
Our legislature comes in the second Monday of January, and we're supposed to stay in session for around 100 days or so. Usually that's through April. Often it gets extended. My first year we were there through the end of Memorial Day weekend. So and you know, then we're off basically in the summer and the fall.
So I guess I can ask another question. As somebody who has a business, how do you juggle both?
Yeah, it's tough. It's really tough, and that's one of the challenges. It's a citizen legislature. You know, sometimes you just have to say, look, I'm going to work on this thing for my private work here, and then I'm going to open up, because you can spend all day just meeting with people if you had the time. Fortunately, I mean, I think anyone down there has figured out how to have a flexible enough life so that from January through April, you can really give it the time that it needs to be good legislators, and then have a decent amount of time in the off session to work on moving bills forward, to work on campaigning, which we're doing right now, and working on all of those other, you know, pieces of things. It takes a lot, especially in a district like LD28. We have volunteers. We have about 50 to 60 volunteers who meet every Saturday morning to make phone calls. We meet virtually on Zoom like this. We have people sending postcards. I mean, there's a lot of effort. We'll literally contact, you know, probably close to 100,000 voters via phone, all with volunteers before November 6th. And that's what it takes to win elections at that state house level. So it's a lot, but you get good at multitasking, I guess.
Yeah, that's gotta be tough. And I think just having elections so often is probably really difficult as well.
I totally agree. At a minimum, I think we should let our state senators go every 4 years instead of everybody's up every 2 years. It's just a constant campaign cycle, which is not no one's favorite.
Right. I think I heard, and I might have heard it from someone here. It's like the day you're elected, you already got to start campaigning.
Yeah, there's some truth to that, unfortunately.
All right, so I'm going to ask one more question. Then, if anyone else has questions they want to unmute their mic. This is also from the chat. He didn't phrase the question really. He said, have you discussed climate issues? And I think maybe to sort of steer the topic even to the fires before we go into the bigger picture of that, I've been reading, and I don't know if it's true, that some of the people are saying that California is really having these issues because of climate issues, in the sense that, you know, people haven't taken care of the forest as much as it should have with controlled burns. And I don't know if it's true, but in general, I guess it's a topic that, you know, we haven't seen the fire season, thank God, the last couple of years, the way California has. But in general, what is your take on that? And what is be able to be done, I guess, in the legislative body for that?
Yeah. Again, this is a depressing answer a little bit, but the legislature has not been responsive, and this is one of the most important things. We haven't been able to get a hearing for a bill that says the state should develop a plan to deal with climate change. Just that simple of saying, like, look, climate change is here, it's real. I grew up in Arizona my whole life. I've never had a summer like this past summer. And they're saying this whole heat island effect, that within another 10 years, we might not get down to overtime lows below 100. I mean, this is real, and we're in many respects on the front lines of it, and the state is doing nothing. I ran a bill to have a modest subsidy for electric school buses, which both, school buses produce a lot of pollution, some of which is quite difficult for young kids who have asthma to deal with. Many other states have moved forward on trying to get their districts to go towards electric school buses. You can even charge them up and capture solar. The fact that we really don't have any state solar policy to really encourage solar adoption, if anything, we've moved back on that. A lot of that stuff ends up getting dealt with by the Corporation Commission, our kind of other branch of government. But it is ridiculous that Arizona hasn't done more to deal with climate change as a state. And it absolutely does not make any sense. Again, there's a set of very common sense things we can do. And I think what you're seeing in California right now, if you really look at it, what's happening with climate change is more and more extremes. So more and more very dry summers, right? Then, you get these small fires that turn into big fires very quickly, and they're stacking right up on top of each other. That is the challenge. But I got to tell you, our forest up north, I mean, we're not far from this stuff in any stretch of the imagination. And I mean, if you drive up to Payson, the whole right side, you see all of that whole area was burned. We've had big fires even last summer around I-17 and over there. Like, we're gonna have to deal with this issue sooner rather than later. And it's something that takes a long-term time horizon to deal with. And unfortunately, we just have not had that, and we need to. And in my view, we just need different leadership down there to get it done.
Oh, thank you for that. Did anyone have any questions specifically for Aaron? Maybe something that we didn't cover, or just a follow-up? Charlie, go for it.
Yes, I do. In this morning's paper, I'm a strong, I'm a supporter of 208. In this morning's paper, excuse me. In this morning's paper, Robert Robb had an article about 208, and he's saying that it's going to cost the small businessman 8% in order when this is, if this is implemented. If it goes into effect.
Yeah.
Now, and then there's another article here by Martini saying that the newspapers are supposed to tell the truth. Now, how can they say that the large corporations are paying 4.5% and it's going to cost the small businessman 8%?
Yeah.
This passes.
There's a lot there. But by the way, 75% of our corporations in Arizona pay $75 a year in taxes, because that's what you have to pay if you owe nothing. In addition to cutting the income tax rate from 8.5% to 4.5%, we cut the corporate tax rate lower and lower and lower. What I think Bob Robb is referring to is that many companies are LLCs that essentially drop on, you file them on your own tax return if you have an LLC, basically. It's the sole proprietor, you own it. I just want to go back to what I kind of said at the beginning. The only earnings that would be subject to that higher tax would be the income, and first of all, anyone who has an LLC, you do all you can to get your expenses covered. Any income that you're showing is what's kind of dropping to the bottom line. That's after you've paid for a whole bunch of other things. Only the income, if you're married above $500,000, would be taxed at that higher rate. So my guess is you could take, I don't know, but my guess is it's 2 out of 100 small businesses that are making more than $500,000 a year, by the way, in profit. I mean, just think about that. That's beyond salaries, that's beyond expenses.
Right, I understand.
Profit. That's what would be subject to that additional, I think, whatever it is, three percentage point kind of surcharge.
But how can Rob say it's 8% and
He's adding the base tax rate of 4.5% to the 3% or whatever it is surcharge, which gets, he's probably saying it's almost 8% or something like that would be my case. I mean, again, I'm not super sure about each of the numbers, but it's just on the dollars above that. And for anyone who watched TV over the weekend, we got some good news in the Cardinals winning there. But boy, were the political ads just crazy. And the political ad on 208 saying only 50% of our dollars go in the classroom is just flat out wrong. That's not included. We literally, our indirect rate, our administration rate is 10%, 90 cents on the dollar, which is lower than just about any other state, goes directly to our students. What they're referring to is a report that shows what classroom spending is, which only counts teachers and instructional aides and textbooks, versus the overall spending. So, you know, the nurse at my kid's school, the guidance counselor, all of those other things, those are things that you need to educate kids today, and they're not being counted in that 55% number. If you look at just the straight administration number, it is literally 10%, and then the national average is 11%. Well, we're well lower than that. On top of that, they also do this whole thing in saying the average teacher gets paid $55,000, but some superintendents make $250,000. Such dishonest intellectually there. The average teacher makes $55,000, but then they're cherry picking the one or two highest paid superintendents to say one superintendent could make that high of an amount, as opposed to what the average stuff is. And I run into this a lot talking to voters and knocking doors. Why do we have to have so much of this overhead, blah, blah, blah? We have less overhead in our schools than in almost any other state in the country. And we need to kind of, you know, prick that bubble and just say, look, I don't know if it's this way, but some way we got to figure out how to fund our schools.
that's for sure.
Good question, though.
Thank you. Anyone else? I have a question that just came in the chat, but it's a woman is asking for her friend. How would somebody find who their representative is?
It is a great question. If you just put into Google, who is my Arizona state representative, one of these things will come up that you can put your address in and it will identify it for you. Again, there's 30 districts, so you're going to be it's going to be LD 1 through 30. That Central Phoenix, Paradise Valley, my area is 28. Just south of us is 24. Over on the Scottsdale side is 23. That's where we actually have a race, a Democrat running, Eric Kurland, who's running against a Republican in an open seat that has a real chance. And then 15 is kind of the north part up. I think for most of the folks on this call, those will probably be, if you live anywhere near kind of the Phoenix PV area, you're in one of those 4 or 5.
Thank you. Did anyone have any questions that wanted to unmute their mic? Don't be shy. Aaron doesn't bite, at least not through Zoom.
No, it's true. I love questions.
Judy, did you have any questions? You're muted though. There you go.
Wanted to thank you for cutting to the chase and getting rid of some of the lies we're hearing on TV. It's very upsetting, this whole election. Is there anything that can be done about making elections honest? In other words, fact checking and then just not allowing lies to be disseminated.
It is a really, really good question, and it's a difficult one. We really need campaign finance reform. We need outlaw dirty money, which was a ballot initiative that former Mayor Terry Goddard, he tried to get it on this ballot again. Again, over the last 3 years, the majority in the House and the Senate have made it more difficult to get things on the ballot, more onerous. There's lots of lawyers. I mean, you saw this thing last go round. You could challenge a 50-word summary or something like that. The judge had to write 100 words to talk about how the 50-word summary wasn't covering enough things. I mean, this doesn't make any sense. Some of that got turned around at the Supreme Court. But I think the real answer is to educate yourself and get involved and get connected with these, I'm partial to these local legislative district races where that's where you can, people will respond and let you know what they're feeling and thinking and kind of get to the bottom. I'll also say, you can follow, if you're Facebook people, you can follow me on Facebook, Aaron Lieberman for Arizona. Local legislative candidates usually put out a lot of information on Facebook, among other places, and just educate yourself and then reach out. And if you see something that you like, particularly on Facebook, don't just like it, but share it. And when you share it, that's what's getting that message out to everybody who's then in your network. And that's how we can kind of combat some of the silliness that's out there and say it. Like, this is really important information. This morning on my campaign Facebook page, that Aaron Lieberman for Arizona, I shared a whole commentary by Steve Irwin, one of our journalists, going through what I just told you about on the Red for Ed stuff around how you should really look at classroom spending. So there's a lot of good information out there. Sometimes, unfortunately, we have to hunt and fight for it in, more ways than we used to.
So we have a really important question on the chat before Charlie asks his second follow-up. How is your mom? This is from Myra.
That's very nice from Myra, who met my mom at Solel Services last go round, and who is a regular on the Saturday Tourist Study. I see Myra there regularly. My mom is doing great. Both of my parents, some of you may know my sister, Julie Lieberman. She actually operates a care home, Angelo Grove, at about 3rd Avenue in Glendale. She lives with her partner back in Massachusetts, and both of my parents are back with them now. As COVID went up and up and up here, we thought that would be the best place for them. They had actually been living at La Siena before that. And so I would call them and describe our 117-degree day. Well, it was like 85 and cool out there. But we're excited about getting them to come back here when things calm down a little bit and when things get a little bit cooler. But they're doing great, and they literally have their own daughter who happens to be a professional in that whole realm caring for them, which is a gift and a blessing for sure.
Yeah, that is nice. Charlie, did you have a follow-up, and then Marcia?
Yeah, I'm an ardent reader of the Arizona Republic, and in yesterday's paper, Valley and State section, there was an article. Yes, politicians can lie in the campaign ads. I thought that was very appropriate for whoever asked about the factual content of campaign ads.
I will go look at that. There's supposed to be fact checking on these things. By the way, I should mention one other thing. I find the best thing to get local political news is KJZZ, the NPR stations, the show that I think it airs at 10 a.m. I always listen to the podcast. They do a great job. They're one of the only people that cover the Capitol, covering the issues that are specific to this state. And you can subscribe to the podcast, and they play it right down the middle. I don't think they're really biased on one side or the other. But if you're interested in getting more good local news, they often have stories on the environment. They often have stories on a lot of the things we're talking about. And since I've gotten involved with the Capitol, honestly, I've probably been to the state Capitol a half a dozen times in my life. Before I got elected, the same people who are very influential down there are often being interviewed on KJZZ's The Show. And so you get a sense of kind of what's really happening in a good way. I definitely would recommend that as a news source for folks.
Thank you. And Marcia, you had a question?
Yeah. Aaron, this might be a little bit more of your personal opinion perhaps, but since you brought up Facebook, they've been in the news quite a bit. Mark Zuckerberg, which is not a nice name, I don't think that I mentioned. And what is your opinion? Because nowadays, I believe, maybe everybody here, that there aren't a lot of young people on Facebook anymore. It's us seniors that are on Facebook. And unfortunately, there is so much, I will say, BS on Facebook, so much misleading lies. I mean, we know there are, bots on there posting, there's interference, there's everything. What do you think can be done? And since Zuckerberg is he's only canceling political ads for 1 week before the election, that's not nearly enough.
Yeah, I don't think they're putting any new political ads for that 1 week. It's a pretty arduous process even to get our ads approved. Look, I think there's a couple of things here. One, I often think Facebook is a symptom, not the disease. The symptom is the polarization in our politics, the desire that so many people seem to have to only get their information and hear from people who think like them, the inability for us to have real discourse. Someone I canvassed on Saturday when I was every Saturday I call voters She said, I think, I don't know if this was here or not. She said her brother had a pub that was like a political pub. It was called Nixon's. And literally they would sit there and watch the news, and Democrats and Republicans would then talk about what was going on. You almost can't imagine a place like that existing today, where you could just sit around in any sort of public setting and have that sort of discussion. And I think that's really missing. I mean, I do think, and increasingly there's been some information on this, a lot of the challenges with Facebook are literally foreign governments getting involved in our elections. I mean, it's a non-trivial thing. I choose my words very carefully. I don't traffic in any sort of conspiracy theory. You can read a lot about this now in literally efforts to exploit kind of simmering divisions that are happening by foreign governments, really happening in the run up to the last election and still happening today. And Facebook is just such a massive system. It's difficult to tamp that out. But the good thing about Facebook, I mean, I would joke, if the LD28 Republicans knew about Facebook 2 years ago, I maybe wouldn't have won, because I was putting videos on Facebook every other day. The people in this community were sharing them and reacting to them. And there are real people on Facebook. And to your point, it's the older people who tend to vote. So there's a real opportunity when people share videos, when people start to get out there, it can be used for good. I've seen that myself. And I think it happens when it's less of the paid stuff and more just the regular people promoting and sharing. I think on Friday or Saturday, I put my first campaign video, like a 2-minute bio video, up on Facebook. It's gotten about 22,000, 2,500 views, and we haven't boosted that at all yet. Those are real people out there looking and seeing and sharing. And I think that's part of the good part about it, when it really is networks of people. That's honestly why I love Facebook. I like to see my nieces, what she's doing after school and so soccer event. Like, when it's actually sharing, enabling sharing and connection, particularly among your family and friends, that's at its best. But there's definitely
if I might say too, I mean, it is the algorithm. So we all have to be really careful about what we do share. Something looks ugly and you want to show people how ugly this is, don't do it.
Yeah.
Don't share it.
I feel terrible, but I have a call that's just starting. I think we went a little long on this, but it was fantastic. I loved it. I'm going to put my information in the chat, and please do not hesitate to reach out if there's ever anything I can do, anything I can do to be helpful. I probably represent a lot of you, would be my guess, and if not, I'm here to be helpful in any way that I can.
Thank you so much. We appreciate all your time on this and everything that you've been doing for the state. Thank you.
And sorry, I have a bum finger, so I'm not very good at typing sometimes. But I'll put my my Ledge email and my office number, and that's my cell number. You can call or text me anytime if people need anything, okay? And definitely follow along on Facebook. I think if you just search @Aaron for AZ on Facebook or Instagram or any of that stuff, you'll get it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Aaron.